Hello and welcome to everyone joining us for this important event. It's usual to start a webinar saying something like, "It's my joy and privilege to welcome you to this event." But this time it's hard for me to say that. What I can say is that in the current circumstances, I am glad that we are together thinking about such a crucial and current topic: Ukraine, church, humanitarian action, and peace. Before going further, let me say something about translation. You can access Italian-English translation by clicking on the world ball icon that you find at the bottom of your screen towards the right. I will say this now in Italian as well, in case there are Italian speakers who have not yet found the translation channel. Si può accedere alla traduzione simultanea in italiano cliccando sull'icona del mondo in fondo dello schermo, a destra, e scegliendo il canale italiano. Two of our respondents prefer to speak in Italian, Marina and Maria. When we get to that moment, and I'll help you all, everyone will need to switch between the English and Italian channels, since at that point, the main language will become Italian and the translator will translate into English. Finally, on the translation point, I hope that during the discussion, we will be able to be in contact with the Vicar Provincial of the Dominican Friars in Ukraine. He will speak in his native Polish and will be translated into English. To hear him in English, you will need to go to the channel Polacco Inglese and choose English, but we will deal with that when we get there. So, when we started the planning of this webinar last Tuesday, a de facto invasion of Ukraine had already begun, but there was no official declaration of war. Today, we are more than 24 hours into a full-blown invasion of the country. The Holy Father, in his audience last Wednesday, just before the official declaration of hostilities, expressed what we all feel. I have great pain in my heart for the worsening situation in Ukraine. Once again, the peace of all is threatened. I want to call all who have political responsibility to a serious examination of conscience before God. He called all, believers and non-believers, to a day of prayer and fasting for peace on Ash Wednesday, March the 2nd, next week. People around the world are showing their opposition to this war. Wouldn't it be wonderful if here in Rome, we could have a march or procession led by the Holy Father, other religious leaders, and the President of Italy? Perhaps the most poignant and striking group of demonstrators are the Russians themselves. This morning, the BBC reported that 1,800 people in more than 50 cities across Russia had been arrested yesterday for demonstrating against their own government's prosecution of this war. In this webinar, we want to recognize them too, and to make it clear that we are not against the Russian people, but only against this war. Around the world, however, people are not only demonstrating, they are also praying for peace and wanting to know how they can give support to the Ukrainian people. And that is why we wanted to run a webinar on humanitarian action and peace building during war, and to focus on the role of the Church in such action. We need to learn fast from past experience and to see what can be done in this new context. To help us do this, we have with us today a person who has dedicated his life to this question, both directly in humanitarian action and as an academic reflecting on this vital work. Dr. Hugo Slim is a senior research fellow at the Las Casas Institute, part of the Dominican House of Studies in Blackfriars, Oxford, where he is developing research on how practical Catholic commitments to social justice support communities living through war, violence, and climate crisis. He is also the academic director of the Oxford Consortium for Human Rights, a group of universities and community colleges in the USA that are hosted in Oxford by the Las Casas Institute. In the past, among many other activities, he has been head of policy and humanitarian diplomacy at the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva, and has also worked as a frontline humanitarian for Save the Children and the United Nations in Morocco, Sudan, Ethiopia, and the Palestinian territories, as well as serving on the boards of Oxfam, Great Britain, and the Catholic Fund for Overseas Development, the British member of Caritas Internationalis. His most recent books are Solferino 21, Warfare, Civilians, and Humanitarians in the 21st Century, published by Hearst this year, 2022, and Humanitarian Ethics, A Guide to the Morality of Aid in War and Disaster, from 2015. Responding to him, we have 3 Ukrainian students in our Faculty of Social Sciences in the Pontifical University of St. Thomas. Elena Kumisarenko comes from the central east of Ukraine, not so far from Odessa, and belongs to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. She is currently pursuing a doctorate with us on the role of women in interreligious perspective in changing current mainstream economic thought and practice. Marina Lelik comes from the west of Ukraine and grew up alongside significant Hungarian minorities. She belongs to the Greek Catholic Eparchy of Mukachevo. In her doctorate, she is looking at how the values of economic actors in Ukraine are changing and the role that Catholic social teaching could play in that change. Maria Vatseba comes from the Ivano-Frankivsk region, also towards the west, and belongs to the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. She is currently completing her license with us. While in Rome, she has been working with the Ukrainian Embassy to the Holy See. After the main talk and the responses, there will be time for open discussion. So now, without further ado, I hand over to our main speaker, Hugo Slim.
Sister Helen, thank you very much. And thank you for asking me to think and pray with you about Ukraine today. The people of Ukraine are enduring a terrible injustice as we meet together here. And my heart also goes out to them and to the wonderful Ukrainians that are with us here today in this seminar. Please know that you are precious and precious to God. I cannot speak with any detailed knowledge or expertise about Ukraine. Sadly, I've not visited Ukraine yet. So instead, I'll speak about 2 things I do know something about. First, politics, war, and humanitarian aid. And secondly, the role the church can play nationally and internationally to support aid and peace. So first, I feel I must talk a bit about the politics. And I want to start by talking about the politics of invasion in our age. And I want to start with the international politics of invasion in recent years. And there have been various forms of invasion so far this century. Invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, led by the US, invasion of Libya, led by the UN and NATO. Saudi Arabia and its allies have invaded Yemen. Russia has invaded Georgia, Crimea, and eastern Ukraine, and it has now invaded all Ukraine. In general, Russian invasions have aimed at annexation. Western invasions have aimed at regime change and the liberalization of society. American-led invasions early in the century certainly set a precedent for invasion. These invasions were orchestrated with UN support and identified themselves as part of the rules-based order of international society. But they were widely contested and resented. and they have invariably increased human suffering and political disorder. And against most measures, they have been a tragic failure. Russia has long viewed the UN mandates of US-led invasions as a political ploy. And Russia hears the discourse of the rules-based order as the language of Western hypocrisy. And by supporting President Assad in Syria, Russia deliberately prevented a Western invasion of Syria. And Putin's circle feel there's nothing exceptional about their invasions compared with US-led invasions. So now I feel I must talk about how I see the Russian policy of invading Ukraine. Russian policy driving the invasion of Ukraine has a nationalist and internationalist dimension. Putin's nationalist purpose is about strategic power and is also deeply theological. He wants to secure Russia's strength as a significant landmass of global power. He also wants to reaffirm a mystical nationalism of Holy Rus that binds Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine as one sacred nation under one church and orbiting Moscow. Putin's international purpose is to balance the West. He argues now by force that the balance of power across Europe has become unfair and that NATO has consistently expanded towards Russian borders after the Cold War. So current Russian invasion policy aims to recover a sacred Russian unity of land and culture and correct the imbalance, as they see it, of political and military power across the European landmass. And this preservation of Russian culture and a push back against Western culture is all laid out strategically in the Russian national security policy that was published last year. It's the real tragedy of today that neither Russia nor NATO have had the leaders we needed to rearrange European security and the balance of power by peaceful diplomacy. As a result, European conflict is militarized and violent once again. I now want to look at the military and political prospects for Ukraine. And I'm afraid I'm going to be very realistic here and see what I see as possibly the worst scenario. And I think this may be painful for Ukrainians to hear, but this is how I would read Russian intention. So I'm afraid I'm going to anticipate terrible things for Ukraine. I hope they will not happen, but my knowledge of war and politics suggests they will, unless Ukraine defeats Russia fast, which is unlikely, or Putin faces a mutiny or a palace coup within the next few weeks. I expect this war to be brutal. Russia will operate a repressive war of occupation, and it has a political project of national transformation to realign Ukraine with Moscow. Putin's project in Ukraine is a comprehensive one. Russia will use intense military force throughout to establish control and prevent dissent. Russia will, first of all, use force to try and capture and destroy the current Ukrainian government and take control of state infrastructure and services. And that is what the Battle of Kiev right now is about. The Russians will then aim to destroy the Ukrainian armed forces over a period of weeks and months, because it sees these armed forces as a deeply Western military and beyond conversion back into forces loyal to Russia. I expect Ukrainian forces to fight hard and well because they are brave, they are good, and they have everything to fight for. There will be very high military casualties, many more military deaths than civilian deaths, unless people rise up in a widespread resistance movement or if warfare goes into the cities. Russia will fight increasingly indiscriminately if it meets significant resistance and suffers rising casualties. Then its warfare will become more indiscriminate and more civilians will be hurt and buildings destroyed. Politically, I expect Russia to subject the Ukrainian people to extremely repressive measures in a deliberate policy of subjection to Russian power. There will be large-scale detention of former government people and anyone who resists, and street protests will be met with military force. Politically, there will be a comprehensive process of Russianization that will seek to end Ukrainian citizenship and reassert some form of Russian identity. And what usually happens, I think the flag will be changed if the Russians take power. Education will be changed too, with a revised curriculum that centers Ukrainian history and culture around Russia. And religion will also be reformed. The Russian Orthodox Church will be deployed, and I would say weaponized, to take control of Christianity in Ukraine. Millions of people will flee the country to avoid this new regime. And this will mean a huge de-skilling in public services and businesses. And I expect Russia will bring in Russian migrants to take their place and invest billions from their reserves in their project to transform the Ukrainian state. And all the time that they are trying to do this, if they succeed in winning, all the time they're trying to do this, Russia will also project its power very aggressively beyond Ukraine to deter NATO and operate its wider policy to rebalance European power. Russia will threaten and attack any interfering states, first via cyber warfare as a response to sanctions, especially against Western financial system, and then by force if necessary. And Putin will be determined to show throughout that he is not afraid of a wider European conflict. So I'm afraid that's the very dismal scenario I think is in Russian policy. So what about humanitarian needs? What will happen in the next few days, weeks, and months? We know that war kills many people with its military violence, but it also impoverishes many more people with its destruction and displacement. People who flee Ukraine will become poor in neighboring countries, and they will need schools and clinics and homes and jobs. People who stay in Ukraine will become poor because of what people call the destruction of essentials around them. The destructions of jobs, job losses, failing clinics, reduced food supplies, interrupted water and electrical supplies, and highly controlled internet and connectivity. Destruction, displacement, and wartime poverty will vary over different parts of the country as the fight for control continues. And not all parts will suffer equally, and some will stay relatively stable. But needs overall will rise as the fabric of society is torn by displacement and fighting. And these needs will be civilian, all sorts of civilian needs for the needs of survival, but also wounded soldiers. There will be a lot of wounded soldiers in this war. And political detainees in prisons will be a huge and invisible group at serious risk. So what are the humanitarian options facing the church agencies today, the wider UN, Red Cross, international agencies? What can humanitarians do in this period of war and repression in Ukraine? International humanitarian agencies are already in East Ukraine and have been there since 2014. And normally at this point in a crisis, UN agencies, the Red Cross movement, NGOs, like Norwegian Refugee Council, Médecins Sans Frontières and others would now raise new money and spread out across Ukraine to develop new humanitarian programs in health, social work and livelihood support. They would be funded by Western governments to expand and scale up to meet the crisis. And the church agencies would also do the same. All these international agencies will try to do this now, but I think the Russians will stop them. Russian policy sees most international humanitarians, UN, INGOs, and parts of the Red Cross movement as deeply Western and full of Western liberal values, a potential source of liberal subversion and part of the Western system. Russia will, therefore, I think, severely restrict international humanitarian movement and operations. They will refuse additional staff, international staff, to enter Ukraine. They will expel some agencies early on to make a point, and they will refuse new entrant agencies into Ukraine. Russia has watched the international humanitarian system in Syria for 10 years, and it will not want this system in Ukraine if it takes control of Ukraine. That's what I think. Instead, I think Russia will set in play its own humanitarian system. It will deploy the Russian Red Cross and co-opt the Ukrainian Red Cross by inserting new leadership. It will introduce new organizations of its own to carry out relief, and it will keep them all tightly controlled by their new government if they take Kiev, the new government in Kiev. Russia will also work hard to retain Ukraine's existing welfare state and public services and argue that there is no emergency. And they will show that by misinformation and disinformation. But if hundreds of thousands of public employees flee or boycott government services, like in Myanmar, then these services will collapse and needs will rise even more sharply. If the country becomes increasingly militarily divided into separate Russian and Ukrainian military zones, Western agencies will be able to work in the Ukrainian zone, and humanitarian response will be divided into two programs. Humanitarian neutrality or solidarity will be a fundamental choice for all humanitarians and church agencies today, from today onwards. The neutral humanitarianism of the ICRC, the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, and UN agencies will try to find its place with the Russians, but it will struggle. Many of these agencies know the Russian foreign ministry well. They know Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister. They know Ambassador Vasily Nebenzia at the UN very well. But Lavrov and his diplomats will have no power in Ukraine. They will be busy acting as sponges, soaking up and deflecting public advocacy against Russia in the diplomatic arena and on the international media. Western neutral humanitarians will never really convince the Russian hardliners driving Putin's invasion project. I expect some Western agencies will be sanctioned and excluded from Russian-controlled Ukraine from the outset, or gradually over time. Their Western financing will be suspect, and they will be seen as agents of the West. So neutral humanitarianism will be given little opportunity to make a big impact. It will be heavily controlled by the Russians, and the operations of the ICRC and the UN agencies that manage to stay will be used tokenistically in Russian propaganda. This leaves the option of solidarity and the option of resistance humanitarianism, solidarity-based aid to surviving elements of the Ukrainian government and to new Ukrainian resistance networks that emerge in the next few weeks and months. In my view, resistance humanitarianism will be the main options for the West, and the Russians will do everything to obstruct and crush it, including calling it out as political interference and false flagging it with links to terrorism, as they did with the white helmets in Syria. But resistance humanitarianism must be tried, and tried increasingly fast, alongside neutral humanitarianism. Ukrainians will need both, and they both have to be tried. So the challenge for the church in all its denominations is extremely important in Ukraine. It has profound spiritual, social, political, and ethical significance to millions of people. often as a primary identity that is equal to their national identity. It also has great importance and potential as a humanitarian network and a force for peace. But Russian policy puts the church in a dangerous situation. Regrettably, I anticipate persecution for the Ukrainian church that is in communion with Rome. And I expect Putin's favored Russian Orthodox Church to play a key role in Russian plans, in a sense, part of the system to re-Russian Ukraine, in line with Putin's own Christian nationalism. And all parts of the church in Ukraine will be faced with a choice between cooperating with Russia or working as a resistance network of aid, and may need to play both strategies depending on where they are and what they can do. So the next few weeks and months will be a very dangerous and potentially sacrificial time for the church in Ukraine. Church leaders may be publicly called out or detained on false charges, and their loyalty will be constantly scrutinized. The church's commitment to peace will also be severely tested because Russia will repress peace activists. Citizen activism will not be tolerated. The invasion must constantly be presented as a success to Putin's home audience. So it's possible that a widespread, non-violent, youth-led resistance arises as before in the Orange Revolution. But this will be discredited as an unrepresentative terrorist puppet of the West by Moscow and severely repressed almost in revenge for the earlier Orange Revolution. If Russia achieves widespread territorial control, any non-violent peace protests will be brutally crushed and followed by widespread detentions and re-education, as in Belarus. This makes the peace challenge extremely hard on the ground for people and for the church. And the church will need to lead it courageously from the pulpit, within the liturgy, and sometimes probably sacrificially. At the international level, the Holy See must do everything it can ecumenically to hold Christian leaders together, to enable humanitarian aid across church networks, and to engage peace talks between politicians. And in doing so, church diplomats, I think, should have three main objectives: to work together to ease the suffering in Ukraine and enable church-based aid, to ensure ecumenical cooperation in Ukraine on justice and peace. So the churches work together on justice and peace. And internationally, to prevent escalation of the war beyond Ukraine. None of this will be easy, especially if the leadership of Putin's favored Russian Orthodox Church takes a stand against Western Christendom in the coming days. But all of us must rise to this challenge of humanitarian aid, justice, and peace in Ukraine. In many ways, the church is the best placed organization in Ukraine to provide humanitarian aid. And it will be difficult, but it can be done. This is a church emergency. It's the moment to care for the wounded, to welcome those who flee, to console those who mourn, to visit prisoners, to speak up for justice, to struggle for peace, and to work ecumenically together as the whole church for those suffering in Ukraine, whoever they are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugo, for those very powerful words. I'd just like to repeat, since we are especially talking about the church in Ukraine, those three objectives that you mentioned towards the end: to ease the suffering in Ukraine and enable church-based aid, to ensure ecumenical cooperation in Ukraine on justice and peace, and to prevent escalation of the war beyond Ukraine. I'm sure there'll be many other things that people will want to bring up again in the discussion, but I just wanted to echo again those three objectives. As we now turn to our three young students, all of them personally affected by this crisis with family in Ukraine, coming from Ukraine and studying with us. So very concerned about the church's role in the social order as we are trying to help them to become more educated to confront in the Faculty of Social Sciences. So I'm going to hand over now to Elena Kumisarenko. I introduced all of our respondents very briefly at the beginning. Elena is doing a doctorate with us, and she is from Central East Ukraine, not that far from Odessa. Thank you very much, Elena.
Thank you. As Sister Helen kindly mentioned, my name is Elena Kumisarenko, and I'm a third cycle student of the Faculty of Social Science. I live in Rome, and I'm speaking from Rome, but I'm originally Ukrainian, and my hometown is Mykolaiv in central east of Ukraine. It's being bombed since yesterday morning, and my family is there right now. And the whole country was attacked yesterday morning, not locally, Donetsk and Luhansk as before. It is hard to be speaking about immediate humanitarian response, but some necessary steps can be taken. Previously, after the attacks in 2014, when only a limited part of Ukrainian territories was under the Russian occupation, the other safe part of Ukraine was able to provide necessary support to refugees through both public and non-governmental channels. Church has always played a crucial role in supporting people in need from occupied territories. The most significant is the project Pope for Ukraine, Papa per Ucraina, launched in June 2016. It is a special humanitarian initiative from the Holy Father Francis, aimed at helping all citizens of Ukraine who became victims of the military operations in the East and turned into internal migrants. The Holy Father donated a significant contribution of 16 million euros. This help was an obvious sign of sympathy from the Catholic Church to the human, with no division by faith, confession, ethnic groups, or political belief, reaching about 900,000 beneficiaries throughout the area of military operations and in the neighboring territories, as well as the territories with the greater presence of internal migrants, Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia, and the region of and the city of Kyiv. The funds were used in particular in emergency projects in the following sectors. First of all, preparation for winter, as the country often reaches temperatures close to -25 degrees Celsius, and installation of boilers in private homes and families, supply of winter clothes, covers, repair, renovation of houses, also educational health facilities was very important and essential at that time, with the use of more than 6 million for over 100,000 beneficiaries. The other sphere is health, with supply of medicine, organization of mobile clinics, purchase of medical pharmaceutical equipment, placing nearly 2.5 million for more than 400,000 people. Nutrition and hygiene, long life food, sanitary products, baby food, hot meals for the poor, hygiene products for infants and pregnant women. The amount used was 6 million in favor of more than 300,000 people. And the last but not least important is psychosociological support for post-traumatic stress disorder. Activities in rehabilitation facilities, renovation of psychological centers, psychological assistance to children and adults, It required more than €1 million for about 15,000 beneficiaries. Mental health is health. And taking into account the need for not only physical assistance, but also psychological recovery for people who came through fears of war, were opened and equipped centers of psychological recovery called ProMir, pro-peace, that had been providing free psychological help for adults and children. For example, talking about the project of realization in Slavyansk, specialists provided more than 4,000 hours of help, in particular workshops, rhythm therapy, correctional groups for children with special needs, lessons in the sensory room, individual consultations, individual lessons with speech therapists. Many parents with their children came to these centers and shared how hiding in basements affected their children and themselves as well. Psychologists working with them stated that children had many symptoms caused by the war. They dealt with fears, sore nightmares, faced troubles in relationships. Some showed aggression, some on the contrary got very closed and found it difficult to communicate. Adults needed to have stability too. If adults are constantly stressed, if they have higher levels of anxiety and risks for that, then children are affected and can hardly be happy, calm, confident. Internally relocated people lost everything: their house, their stable picture of the world. They have no idea what to expect from the future and how to feed a baby, as the situation is constantly changing. Friends are far, relatives are even further. All the communications could take place only over phone. All of these things can hardly give a ground to rely on. So the centers of psychological support restore this ground and search for the strengths to move on. Right now, all over Ukraine, churches are used as shelters. Heads of Ukrainian churches and religious organizations are calling on Vladimir Putin to stop the outbreak of war. This is stated in the appeal of all Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations, sent to the President of the Russian Federation on February 23, 2022, the day before yesterday. I cite, "We authoritatively and unambiguously testify that the Ukrainian people do not seek war, and we consider it a common duty to believers to stop it before it's too late. The supreme commandment, do not kill, determines the absolute value of human life and the God's severe punishment for the murderer. Aggressive war is a great crime against the Almighty." Ukrainian religious figures said in an address to Vladimir Putin, "The All-Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations calls on the President of Russia for a peace dialogue as the only pious way to resolve mutual difficulties and contradictions, and is ready to promote such a dialogue." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena, and very relevant to our current circumstances, focusing so much on the humanitarian action of the Holy Father and giving us a lot of information about how it worked in the past, which is of course relevant to our current situation. So now I'm going to hand over to Marina. Marina Lelik is from right in the western part of Ukraine. She grew up with Hungarian minority communities. She belongs to the Greek Catholic Eparchy of Mukachevo, and she will be speaking in Italian now. So if you are listening to the main channel in English, you need to click on the interpretation button and go to English. because the main language now will become Italian and our translator will translate into English. So you need to go to the English channel if you want to hear her in English. Thank you very much, Marina.
Salve a tutti, sono Marina. Vi racconto questa situazione dal punto di vista di una cittadina ucraina. Quando parliamo di Ucraina, parliamo principalmente di persone concrete, di vite umane, famiglie, città. Non è facile per me parlare perché si tratta di persone che conosco o che i miei amici conoscono. Troppo difficile parlare dopo l'attacco di ieri. Abbiamo un amico di nostra famiglia. Quando era seminarista prestava servizio come militare, poi cappellano militare ed ora si trova in missione proprio in quei territori. Noi abitiamo in una regione dove non c'è ancora guerra, dove non è arrivata. A lui abbiamo dato la disponibilità della nostra casa. Lui da lì gestisce la preghiera online, organizza e accoglie le persone, soprattutto bambini, e coinvolge altre persone di altre regioni per dare ancora possibilità di vita. Quando parliamo di come può evolversi la situazione di ciascuno dei possibili scenari dell'invasione russa dell'Ucraina, per me significa parlare della vita di persone a me care. Di tutti gli scenari possibili si sta verificando uno dei più gravi. La Russia sta entrando praticamente in tutta Ucraina. Come procede gestione in altre zone fuori conflitto? Nella mia regione, la Transcarpazia, ci si prepara di accogliere i rifugiati. Si organizzano accogliere tutti i letti e pasti. Il capo amministratore dell'amministrazione statale regionale ha incaricato di preparare locali, impianti sportivi, club e altre strutture della comunità per alloggio e il pasto degli sfollati. Già hanno preso le persone nei pensionati. Le chiese locali hanno anche espresso la loro volontà di aiuto concreto, cominciando a accogliere cibo, cose di prima necessità, anche sono pronte a accogliere le persone in case parrocchiali. Ieri abbiamo gestito l'arrivo dei prodotti igienici come dentifricio, shampoo, crema per mani, a cui di solito non si pensa. Devo dire che le persone sono aperte a dare aiuto ai futuri rifugiati, almeno con quelli che noi ieri abbiamo parlato. Come finirà la situazione dipenderà ovviamente dalla relazione dell'Occidente. Già gli Stati Uniti e i loro alleati hanno dovuto imporre severe sanzioni economiche alla Russia per allentare la pressione sull'Ucraina senza aspettare un'invasione. Avvertimento sulla rimozione del personale dell'ambasciata statunitense è un malintenso, poiché contribuisce all'isolamento dell'Ucraina e all'aumento dei suoi problemi economici e di contro rafforza le affermazioni di Putin secondo cui la Russia sosterrà l'Ucraina a differenza dei paesi occidentali. Fino a ieri le persone vivevano la loro vita in Ucraina, la loro vita normale, nonostante gli eventi in Oriente. I prezzi stanno aumentando, le persone non possono permettersi quello che potevano prima. Gli ucraini non vogliono tornare indietro nel tempo in cui il nostro paese era governato dalla Russia come parte dell'Unione Sovietica. Era un periodo completamente diverso. Putin si è sentito minacciato dalla crescente economia di mercato dell'Ucraina e dalla sua attrazione per Occidente. Ora Putin sta cercando di mantenere la sua posizione. Ovviamente vorrei parlare di coloro che sono al fronte. Grazie a cui Ucraina e Europa possono dormire tranquilli, militari, cappellani, operatori sanitari e volontari, dove non c'è divisione, di fronte alla morte sono tutti uguali. E tutti hanno un obiettivo, la pace e la vita di persone, un chi si vuole bene. Preghiamo per loro soprattutto per mantenere la tranquillità ed essere in grado prendere decisioni adeguate anche nei momenti più difficili. Ma da ieri tutta Ucraina ha sentito rumori di armi. ha visto bombardare aeroporti e colpire quasi tutta infrastruttura militare. Si vede che tutti sono nella paura, soprattutto bambini e ragazzi. Come gestiscono le chiese? Sono chiamate alla preghiera. Le persone si uniscono in privato nella preghiera 24 su 24, creano gruppi di preghiera, diverse comunità pregano ed operano per la pace. Si può vedere come le persone si uniscano anche per darsi aiuto materiale. Anche quelle unite dalla preghiera formano centri di raccolta fondi, trovano alloggio per possibili rifugiati. Sì, persone le hanno paura, una grande paura, ma nonostante ciò fanno le cose incredibili. Danno a me ed altri che siamo all'estero la forza e la speranza di andare avanti. Siamo supportati da quasi tutto il mondo. Ho parlato a Roma con una donna e ha detto che stava pregando per noi. Ho chiesto di ricordare nella preghiera soprattutto dei bambini che vedono questa realtà di guerra, perdono i padri al fronte e hanno paura, in modo che nonostante questo possano fidarsi di Dio, che vuole bene. E così questa donna a Roma ha parlato con catechisti che involgono i bambini italiani che pregano per bambini ucraini. È incredibile. Ogni tipo di sostegno, anche da parte dei bambini, ci fa sperare che tutto andrà bene. Vorrei raccontare anche del periodo clandestino della Chiesa cattolica nel periodo sovietico. Quale era la realtà? Tutto si faceva durante notte, liturgia, sacramenti, non in chiesa. Esempio, quando il sacerdote celebrava la liturgia a casa, la vasca era piena di acqua calda. Se improvvisamente entravano in casa persone sconosciute o addirittura la polizia, si faceva finta che il prete, venuto a casa ad amici, stava facendo il bagno o comunque era venuto semplicemente a cena. Abbiamo conosciuto una donna non sposata, molto buona. Abbiamo incontrato di nuovo quando Ucraina era già indipendente ed abbiamo visto che è diventata suora. Le ho chiesto di raccontare di questi periodi di clandestinità. Non si parlava neanche a livello familiare di queste cose, diceva. Nella stessa settimana, per caso, si incontrara lei e sua cugina appena entrate in monastero per iniziare il noviziato. Quando si ascoltava Radio Vaticana, la casa era chiusa e solo una persona rimaneva fuori casa per fare la guardia. Un altro esempio, mia nonna quando studiava all'università incontrava il suo prof durante una liturgia natalizia e lei ha chiuso occhi, ma il prof si è avvicinato e disse: Anna, io non ti ho visto e tu non hai visto me. Questo significava che gente aveva bisogno di chiesa, fede, verità. Come si riconosceva una casa in cui vivevano persone cattoliche, dove c'erano icone con sacri cuori o si potevano vedere il rosario. Adesso è più semplice unirsi, aiuta tanto internet, social, gruppi Viber, WhatsApp, Telegram, Zoom. Noi siamo diversi come abbiamo prima. Già abbiamo superato il periodo sovietico, la rivoluzione arancione, la rivoluzione della dignità. In quegli 8 anni abbiamo sperimentato cosa è guerra. Ora incontriamo le persone reali come voi, che voi siete pronti a dare un aiuto. Tutti insieme con la grazia di Dio dobbiamo resistere. Dobbiamo essere consapevoli che ci sta guerra, una vera guerra, che è possibile che si sta sviluppando in ampio raggio. Dobbiamo essere consapevoli e riflettere. Queste sono vite individuali, migliaia di persone, milioni, in cui vite sono in pericolo. Ringrazio per il sostegno e la preghiera per Ucraina. Invece di pensare solo ai piani dell'aggressione russa, diffondiamo e continuiamo a parlare della necessità di sostegno dell'Ucraina, di conoscere l'Ucraina, il nostro popolo, persone che anche nella paura sanno unirsi e aiutare, cercare la pace. Grazie.
Thank you very much, Marina. Also showing us a bit how the history of the country in some ways gives people some preparation for the phase of history they may be going into now, all the ways in which you had to cope with the Soviet oppression may give you some resources now, coping resources, and you know, we can see it's a kind of sad thing to say, but it did prepare you a bit for this phase of your history. Okay, great. So now we will go to Maria. Maria Vatseba is also from Ukraine. She is from the Ivano-Frankivsk region, which is also towards the western side of Ukraine. And she's doing a license with us. And she also has experience of working in the Ukrainian embassy to the Holy See. So thank you very much, Maria. She will also speak in Italian. Okay, so please stay where you are in terms of your language.
Sì, buongiorno a tutti. Sinceramente, come per le mie colleghe, anch'io ribadisco che è difficile parlare in questa situazione odierna. Si spacca il cuore se siamo lontani, abbiamo dei parenti, delle persone care, e quindi veramente a sentire le notizie sia dai telegiornali che di persona dalle persone care, viene da piangere, non si può dormire e tutto il resto. Grazie per questo invito, per questa iniziativa che è molto importante per tutti noi ucraini, di essere portavoci in ogni parte del mondo, che dobbiamo infatti fornire queste informazioni. È il compito primario, direi, di ogni cittadino. Noi stiamo aiutando al nostro popolo, siamo vicini anche da lontano. Ognuno che con quello che può sempre aiuta, sia finanziariamente che con supporto, oppure qualcuno parte pure per andare lì fisicamente. E quello che vorrei dire oggi, adesso in questo evento, vorrei sottolineare anzi che oggi l'attenzione di tutto il mondo è concentrata sulla situazione in Ucraina, sì, ma è sufficiente solo osservare, esprimere le preoccupazioni, come fanno molti leader politici. Sì, oggi gli Stati Uniti e l'Unione Europea propongono le sanzioni pesanti alla Russia, ma finora, dopo l'annessione legittima della Crimea, è stato evidenziato che non sono sufficienti solo le sanzioni. Putin con proprie azioni tantissime volte ha violato il diritto internazionale, tantissime volte ha dimostrato che le sanzioni infatti non lo spaventano né fermano. Da questo punto di vista io mi pongo una domanda. Chi a livello internazionale ha permesso al presidente russo di provare a espandere l'egemonia russa su altri territori sovrani? Con la parola provare sottolineo che non ci riuscirà, no. Coloro che seguono i fonti ufficiali dei governi si dovrebbero ricordare che il governo ucraino da parecchi mesi annunciava, allarmava con le dichiarazioni e tanti discorsi sulla escalazione militare russa vicino ai confini ucraini, nonché di pericolo di invasione delle truppe russe sul territorio ucraino, quello che abbiamo oggi, purtroppo. Da decenni l'Ucraina sta elaborando i piani per adesione alla NATO, ma finora non è ancora diventata il suo membro. Quante prove sono necessarie ancora per essere assunta tra i paesi alleati della NATO? Quanta gente deve morire ancora, soprattutto dopo 8 anni di guerra ibrida in Ucraina? Se il mondo intero non si renderà conto che Putin sta verificando come si comporteranno le organizzazioni internazionali, considerando la situazione dell'Ucraina, queste azioni da parte russa non avranno mai la fine, cioè andrà a larga scala. Questo è il pericolo globale e non può essere l'Ucraina lasciata e osservata solamente. Dopo tutti questi anni di guerra ibrida in Ucraina, Putin ha osservato anche l'efficienza ed efficacia delle organizzazioni internazionali. Ha dimostrato che i principi, statuti, regole per lui non hanno nessuna importanza. Gli Stati Uniti sono disposti a sanzionare la Russia ancora di più e di proteggere in tutti i modi i territori della NATO. E se la questione ucraina per adesione in alleanza oggi avrebbe il successo, come si comporterebbe il Putin? Il popolo ucraino ultimi 8 anni vive una grande difficoltà e oggi la situazione è peggiorata gravemente. Tutti i militari, giovani ragazzi, padri, nonni, mariti e mogli stanno combattendo per proteggere la propria patria ucraina. Moltissime persone civili si iscrivono in esercito per questo combattimento. Lo spirito del patriottismo, con radice della parola patria, in Ucraina non è mai smesso di diffondersi. Esiste in ogni angolo dell'Ucraina, in ogni casa, in ogni parte del mondo dove vivono gli ucraini. E vorrei citare anche che nel libro Memoria e Identità San Giovanni Paolo II fa risalire il termine sia patria che il patriottismo al 4° comandamento. La patria in un certo senso si identifica con il patrimonio, con l'insieme di beni che abbiamo ricevuto in retaggio dai nostri padri. E per questo il patriottismo, collocandosi al quarto comandamento, ci impegna ad onorare il padre e la madre. La patria è così collegata con la famiglia ed ambedue rimangono realtà insostituibili. E in queste considerazioni il popolo ucraino infatti si unisce ancora di più per proteggere anche i propri valori, territori, le vite degli altri, cultura ed identità. È un grande sacrificio, grande martirio innocente del mio popolo ucraino. Non è l'Ucraina che pretende di occupare i territori della Russia. L'Ucraina è uno Stato sovrano e non si è mai permessa di invadere sui territori di altri Stati sovrani. Oggi si tratta della difesa, nonostante le paure dalle azioni dello Stato vicino per il popolo civico, il popolo ucraino è unito. E questi moltissimi sacrifici avranno le conseguenze terribili, perché la storia delle 2 guerre mondiali ci racconta fino ad oggi delle conseguenze del dopoguerra. Le case distrutte, i figli senza genitori, stati della salute sia fisica che mentale, le conseguenze per l'ecologia e tanto altro. Paesi di tutte le parti dell'Europa, vi prego di svegliarsi, perché oggi ha subito l'Ucraina e domani può essere qualunque altro Stato sovrano. Grazie.
Thank you very much again, Maria. A personal testimony, but also like our other respondents talking about the last 8 years. This is a country that has been involved in military operations for not just 24 hours, but for a lot longer period. So before we go to our discussion, I just wanted to ask Hugo again if he wanted to make any response to the respondents, and also say that we have put into the chat a link with the talk that Hugo just gave. Maybe I'll ask our staff if they could just put it in again in case anybody missed it. So you can download the comments of Hugo from the chat. So Hugo, please, if you have anything further to say to us at this stage.
Thank you. No, just to thank the contributors so much, Elena, Marina, and Maria. Incredibly powerful, and it gives me great confidence in Ukraine that there will be ultimate victory and resurrection here because of the sort of people you are. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your ideas, and your hope and determination.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Hugo. So now we're going to move into the next part of our webinar, which is a general discussion. I'm glad to say we've got quite a nice long period for it, so I hope we can hear quite a few people. If you want to speak, please press the little indicator, the little icon at the bottom of your screen, raise hand. Okay, so then we know who wants to speak. Okay, We'll try to get as many people to speak as possible. So, you know, if you could try to be as brief as you can, that would also help. Obviously, if we're asking questions, we'll need to go back to Hugo or maybe some of our respondents as well. Okay, but before, to let you think a little bit more and raise your hands, I would like now to give the opportunity to Philip Madonna to say a few words. I asked him to come and join the discussion already. He's had a very interesting career, much of it as an ambassador in different parts of Central and Eastern Europe, but I got to know him as ambassador to the Holy See. And he's now the founder and director of a very interesting center, which maybe he will say something to you about in Dublin City University as well. So thank you very much, Philip.
Thank you very much, Helen. Can you hear me now? Great. Yes, I served as Irish ambassador in Finland, Russia, the OSCE, and I also worked in the CSCE process. I was the desk officer in the European Secretariat for the Charter of Paris. That's a long time ago, but I've had a very long engagement with these issues. Cardinal Hollerich, speaking yesterday on behalf of Comese, stated the following: "We urgently ask the international community, including the European Union, not to cease seeking a peaceful solution to this crisis through diplomatic dialogue. We call on the European leaders gathering today for a special meeting of the European Council to show unity and endorse measures promoting de-escalation and confidence building, while avoiding any steps that could potentially reinforce the violent conflict." Sorry, that was my phone. So what could Cardinal Hollerich's words mean in practice? I would like to address this question under 4 headings: the unity of the European Union, the Northern Ireland peace process, the background to the current crisis, and some ideas for a diplomatic dialogue. In partnership with the Irish churches and faith communities, the centre of which I'm director has hosted a meeting over the past few days to develop shared thinking on the Conference on the Future of Europe. Many issues were raised, which I don't have time to go into, but overall, our emerging conclusion is that the path to unity within the European Union, as proposed by Cardinal Hollerich, is to allow the global common good to shape our actions at home and abroad. In terms of serving the global common good, the most important idea was that we need to reappropriate our understanding of the European Union as a peace project in the spirit of the founders. The Northern Ireland peace process, in which I participated for many years, is an example of how the European Union can build peace in other situations. In Ireland, our historical experience enables us to empathize with the situation in which Ukraine finds itself in relation to its larger neighbor. Many British people have looked on Ireland much as Russia looks on Ukraine. In the century since independence, Ireland has been careful never to pose a military threat to Britain. We have fought to preserve a common travel area across the 2 islands, along with many other special arrangements. Regarding Northern Ireland and the partition of the island, we have sought to light a candle instead of cursing the darkness. My hope is that as and when a ceasefire is possible, that we can borrow some ideas from our Irish experience, even extending to the structuring of negotiations to support Ukraine, while at the same time ensuring that the European Union's relations with Ukraine and Russia are less of a zero-sum game as seen from Moscow. I turn now to some historical issues. At this liminal moment, we in the European Union can make an important contribution to peace by reflecting in a spirit of critical self-awareness on 2 issues that have disempowered European Union diplomacy over the past 2 decades. First, a loss of focus on the Helsinki principles, and second, Afghanistan, which is a partner country of the OSCE, understood as a case study in how we have collectively taken a wrong turn. It is often asserted by political leaders from Western countries that the 10 principles of the Helsinki Final Act are, quote, not open to interpretation or negotiation, and that the, quote, security order, unquote, either a European or a global order, is undermined only by Russia. This is not a thesis that stands up if we subject it to close examination. In fact, the Helsinki Final Act states all the principles are of primary significance, each of them being interpreted taking into account the others. And in fact, the European Union and the United States have interpreted these principles at particular moments in the light of what we on our side, but without international consensus, consider to be higher considerations of justice or fairness. The main point here concerns what I would call our paradigm of security. The Helsinki process, beginning in 1972, has sought to build confidence and trust across a range of common concerns while promoting transparency and disengagement in the military sphere. What is aimed for is a change in assumptions. For example, in the 19th century, among the Nordic countries, military equations became progressively less relevant. In the Helsinki Final Act, we committed ourselves to taking measurable steps towards general and complete disarmament under international control. Security, according to the Helsinki paradigm, is indivisible. We're referring not to a military balance, but to the moral quality of a shared public space. The ultimate origin of this vision of peace building is the concept of a common peace developed in Greece in the 5th century BC. At the end of the Cold War, the US and its allies began to promote the concept of interlocking institutions. This way of thinking obscured the difference between the alliance deterrence paradigm of security and the ideal of an indivisible common peace as envisaged in the UN Charter and the Helsinki Final Act. Since the 1990s, concerns have consistently been raised about the marginalization of the OSCE by NATO. An important factor in the background is that promises made to the Russians by the US and Germany in the context of German unification have been broken. Despite these promises, and for reasons which I have never fully understood, the expansion of NATO and the enlargement of the European Union have been treated in parts of Europe as a single project. In the meantime, the US and NATO are by far the largest military spenders in the world. NATO, the US, and the UK have launched military operations and invasions outside the framework of international law, operations that have not always borne good fruit. Collectively, European countries are the second biggest supplier of arms in the world. European weaponry is being used in conflict zones such as Yemen, Gaza, and Ethiopia. Many refugees arriving on European shores or in European countries are fleeing conflict or human rights abuses fueled by our own arms sales. Assertions that a constantly expanding NATO, by definition, poses no threat to anyone, reflect a self-referential morality. Now, as I was listening to this discussion, I was disturbed to find that there is no reference so far in the discussion to the actual events in Ukraine in 2014, the stages by which military operations developed in the summer of 2014, and the actual content of the Minsk agreements of September 2014 and February 2015. Policy towards the breakup of Yugoslavia involved an interpretation in the light of other principles of Principle 4 concerning the territorial integrity of states. The principle of uti possidetis was used to justify the recognition of each constituent entity of Yugoslavia as an independent state. Arguably, another principle concerning the peaceful settlement of disputes ought to have led to a much greater focus on the inevitable impact of the breakup of Yugoslavia on Bosnia in particular. In a later phase, we had the war in Yugoslavia, cast as a humanitarian intervention, which again involved a departure from the letter of the Helsinki Principles. If there were time, I could review several other principles and how they have been interpreted concerning, for example, sovereign equality, non-intervention, and the obligation in Principle 9 to develop our cooperation across a number of named sectors. The second area in which European diplomacy is disempowered is in relation to Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet invasion was decided without full consideration of the consequences, and one immediate outcome was to undermine the CSCE and in particular its economic dimension. In 1989, under Gorbachev, at the first ever meeting between a Soviet foreign minister and the foreign ministers of the European community as a group, Moscow's core objective was to start a political dialogue on Afghanistan. We turned the Russians down. At the time, the British and US intelligence services were busy arming the Mujahideen. Today, after so much suffering on all sides, with millions of Afghans on the brink of famine, what lessons have been learned? On the 11th of February, President Biden signed an order to expropriate $7 billion in Afghan assets frozen in the United States, splitting the money between humanitarian aid and a fund for 9/11 victims. This action, which again raises questions of international jurisprudence, disempowers the de facto government in Kabul and contributes directly to a famine which the previous actions of the US government have largely brought about. In the few minutes remaining, I will discuss diplomatic options. First, we need confidence building. Constructive relationships rarely wholly vanish, even in the midst of a crisis. In politics and public administration, there are always good people on the lookout for openings that they can reasonably support. The personalized approach to sanctions against Russia, favored by many Western actors, creates the risk of what John Henry Newman terms poisoning the wells. Those who work within a defective political context, as we all do, are branded in advance as criminal. They're demonized in such a way that by definition, their voices must not be heard. This is not how Jesus dealt with Roman officials. In the bigger global picture, areas of interdependence never wholly vanish and will need to be restored in future if peace is our goal. In the ancient world, it was considered inhuman to destroy olive trees. Today, we boast of our ability to destroy the economic prospects of entire populations. Not demonizing the other and not promoting the escalating destruction of ordinary people's livelihoods are a matter of basic diplomatic practice. Beyond this, we need to see the vulnerability of life on this planet and the changes that are happening around us in the natural world, in the world of technology, in society, and in politics. The pandemic reminds us further of our fragility. We have ample capacity to destroy one another several times over through weaponry, cyber warfare, and the interruption of trade and communications. Conflict leads to floods of refugees, as I mentioned a moment ago. In the wider Europe, in the face of these dangers, we badly need to image a state of peace. Here I have something very specific to suggest, and I'm coming to the end now. It may prove possible in due course for the European Union to use the forthcoming 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act in 2025, the so-called Helsinki Plus 50 anniversary, to revive the OSCE or something like the OSCE across all the main dimensions of its comprehensive agenda. The Helsinki Final Act of 1975 rested on preparations that began in 1972. We can begin now in 2022 to put in place confidence building measures and to start talks about talks regarding a future summit. In most of the relevant policy areas, the European Union and its member states have the ability and the resources to lead. I do not pull this idea out of the air. In December, the 57 participating states of the OSCE decided that Finland will exercise the OSCE chairmanship in 2025. Throughout the region, we remain committed in principle to the letter, the model, and the spirit of Helsinki, as described by Finland's President Niinistö before the chairmanship vote. President Niinistö also stated, "We are looking at ways to combine the Helsinki spirit approach with the Our Common Agenda process at the United Nations. This continent can become a sign of hope for the rest of the world if we open the door now to preparations for a transformative all-European summit, the first since 2010. Such a summit can become a regional building block, even the cornerstone in the revival of global diplomacy. A broad-based dialogue on the grand challenges of our time will assist all of us to build responsive and responsible societies." Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Very, very interesting. We are getting some requests on the chat to be able to share your comments. If you wouldn't mind sending them to us, we can.
Yes. Okay.
We can put them into a PDF and share them on the chat. We have already, some people were asking for Dr. Slim's talks. We have shared them already on the chat. We can maybe share them again from time to time. Perhaps that's a good idea. I don't know whether, Hugo, would you like to say anything in response to Philip's comments?
No, I'm just really glad, Philip, that you said what you said and that you've made a diplomatic call to create a level playing field to try and rethink security in Europe, because I think it hasn't happened.
Great. Okay. Well, we have some people with their hands raised. We will get to you as soon as possible. But first of all, I would like to turn now to listen to the Vicar Provincial in Ukraine and his brother, Tomasz, who will translate for us into English. Those of you who are listening in English then, and indeed anybody, the main language will become Polish now, I think. So if you want to hear in English, you have to go to the interpretation button and choose English, okay? I don't think we can get translation to Italian of this little bit, but it's very, very important for us to hear, I think, from the Provincial Dominican Friars in Ukraine now, something from what is going on the ground. So thank you too very much to Fra Tomasz for doing the translation for us. If you would go ahead, Father.
Okay. Bardzo dziękuję siostrze Helen za zaproszenie mnie do udziału w tym spotkaniu. Od razu przeproszę, że moja wypowiedź nie będzie jakoś tak bardzo przygotowana jak wcześniejsze wypowiedzi. Bardziej będzie takim podzieleniem się na gorąco tym doświadczeniem, które właśnie przeżywam, mieszkając w Kijowie. Rzeczywiście jest tak, to po raz pierwszy w życiu tego doświadczam, nigdy nie spodziewałem się, że znajdę się w środku wojny. Że faktycznie od czasu do czasu za moim oknem tutaj w klasztorze słychać gdzieś z oddali syren czy odgłos wybuchających bomb. Na szczęście jakoś to miejsce, w którym znajduje się nasz klasztor, jednocześnie Instytut Świętego Tomasza z Akwinu, bo to jest też naszym główną misją jako dominikanów w Kijowie, instytut, który prowadzimy. Na szczęście to miejsce jest w miarę spokojne w tym momencie. Chociaż oczywiście pewni być nie możemy, co będzie się działo za kilka godzin czy w nocy. Zwłaszcza, że niedaleko nas jest taka wielka wieża telewizyjna, skąd nadaje telewizja publiczna. Oraz część dowództw wojskowych ukraińskich. Więc potencjalnie jest to również miejsce niebezpieczne. To jest też, myślę, dla nas takie nowe doświadczenie uczenia się Kościoła w tak niezwykłych i trudnych warunkach. Zwłaszcza dla nas, Europejczyków, Polaków czy Ukraińców, którzy nie doświadczaliśmy jeszcze tego typu sytuacji. Choć trzeba powiedzieć, że wielu moich kolegów, księży, Ukraińców ma już to doświadczenie za sobą, będąc kapelanami na terenach, gdzie toczy się od 2014 roku wojna. Dzisiaj w południe mieliśmy spotkanie również na Zoomie z naszym biskupem Witalijem Krywickim, wszystkich księży w diecezji pracujących. Bo tylko w ten sposób możemy się w tym momencie spotkać. I widać, że właściwie wszyscy, czy prawie wszyscy są na miejscu, są w parafiach, w kaplicach, w miejscach, gdzie posługujemy. To jest, myślę, też taki znak tego, że chcemy być i jako dominikanie, ale też księża, którzy pracują w diecezji, tam, gdzie są ludzie. Tak jak wspomniałem, my prowadzimy Instytut Świętego Tomasza, nie mamy parafii, kościoła parafialnego w Kijowie. Ale również już wczoraj wieczorem kilku naszych studentów, a dzisiaj jeszcze więcej osób przyszło i poprosiło, czy mogą się zatrzymać. Boją się być sami, boją się, jeśli mieszkają w takich słabo zabezpieczonych miejscach. Oczywiście przyjęliśmy ich i będziemy razem przez najbliższe dni. Podzielę się jeszcze takim ciekawym doświadczeniem. Pół roku temu przez 2 tygodnie mieszkali u nas uchodźcy z Afganistanu. Kiedy zajmowany przez talibów. Stolica Apostolska przez Ukrainę ewakuowała grupę studentów Uniwersytetu Amerykańskiego w Kabulu. Znaczy studentów miejscowych, tylko amerykańskiego uniwersytetu, nie Amerykanów. Wczoraj napisała do mnie Hadzira, która jest teraz w Rzymie, studiuje na jednym z uniwersytetów rzymskich. Pytając, jaka sytuacja u nas. Podzieliłem się z nią właśnie tą niepewnością, którą przeżywamy. I ona powiedziała, doskonale cię rozumiem, bo niedawno to wszystko myśmy przeżywali u siebie w Afganistanie. Więc wydawałoby się, że tak odległe doświadczenia, odległe w sensie też perspektywy geograficznej, Afganistan, Kijów, dzisiaj stały się czymś tak jednoczącym. Także no, żyjemy w dużej niepewności, co będzie za kilka godzin czy za kilka dni, ale mamy nadzieję, że ten konflikt uda się jakoś ograniczyć, że nie doprowadzi do przelewu, do śmierci zbyt wielu osób. I dodam tylko, że też dziękuję za zorganizowanie tego spotkania, bo wiem, jak bardzo cenne dla wielu ludzi tutaj na Ukrainie są każde gesty takiej troski płynące ze świata. Także jeszcze raz dziękuję za zaproszenie.
Thank you so much, Father Jarosław, and to Father Tomasz. It's really great for us to hear you, to be with you, and to be able to share this moment, and to promise you that we will continue to pray. At the end of this session, we have prayers together. So we are with you in the spirit, united in the spirit.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So now we can turn to some of the other people who've been waiting patiently with their hands raised. What about Elizabeth Betty? Would you like to speak? If you could open her microphone, great. Sister Betty, I think you can speak now. I don't know about anybody else, but I can't hear her at the moment. Okay, maybe she isn't here. Okay, what about Cavallo? Father Andrea, Cavallo.
Buonasera, buongiorno.
Buonasera,
Buongiorno.
buonasera. Ok.
Mi
Buongiorno.
sentite?
Sì, grazie. Prego.
Volevo sapere, io non ho dormito tutta la notte un po' come solidarietà per il popolo ucraino. Si parlava di salute mentale o di salute psicologica. La mia salute psicologica non è delle migliori, mi immagino quella del popolo ucraino. Volevo sapere se l'Europa non darà sanzioni severe a Putin, come spiegherà l'opinione pubblica che Putin ha fatto un'opera tremenda Se l'Europa non sarà ferma su questo punto, come lo spiegherà l'opinione pubblica? Dirà che Putin ha fatto un'operazione speciale, come l'ha chiamata lui, o un'invasione? Inoltre, non capisco come si possa parlare di Irlanda o Helsinki. Beh, di Helsinki posso dire che la Finlandia si è detta possibilista nell'entrata nella NATO. Non si capisce la Turchia qual è la sua alleanza con la NATO. Inoltre, si è parlato di comunismo e di pace. Erano già difficili i rapporti ecumenici prima di questa guerra. Non capisco fino a che punto si possa parlare di comunismo con una Chiesa ortodossa che non ha di fatto detto una parola a favore della pace. Il patriarca di Mosca, Kirill, non ha detto una parola. Non capisco con chi possiamo parlare. Cosa significa pace oggi? Cosa significa comunismo? E come l'Europa non dovrebbe sanzionare Putin? Queste sono le mie domande. Grazie.
Thank you very much, Brother Andrea. I don't know whether any of us, maybe Hugo, would you like to say something, or shall we take some more questions? Yeah, we'll listen to a few more people first. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Father Andrea. We will pick up your points along with some others.
Grazie a voi, grazie. Scusate la mia...
Thank you. So what about, is Elizabeth Betty still there? Can you speak now? We still can't hear. There's something wrong with your microphone, I think. We can't quite hear you. Okay, what about Anna Maria? Anna Maria? I can hear something, but not your voice yet.
This is Danielle. I
Danielle.
mistakenly raised my hand. I don't really need to say anything. I'm learning so much just listening.
Okay, great. Okay, Danielle, thank you. What about Alice? Alice Dower. Can you speak, Alice? We're having some problems with the connections. Her microphone is off at the moment, looks like. Alice Dower.
Sister, I can't hear you. You're muted.
Yeah, Valerio, can you open Alice Dower's microphone, please? Usual technical problems. Okay, none of the people with their hands raised have got their microphones open. Okay, we need to open the microphones. Okay, you have to open your own microphone as well. They have been opened for you to speak with the main audience, but each one of you has to open your own. Mary Craven has opened her microphone now, I can see.
Okay.
Stefano, Mary Craven, please go ahead. That's great.
Thank you. Sister Helen, I have several of concerns that you might have seen in the chat. I'd like to know, how could we possibly help the Ukrainian people right at this very moment who are huddled in tunnels and subway undergrounds and in churches? And how do we help the dissenting Russian, especially the young people who are apparently spearheading the dissent? And they are going to be in for lifelong retribution unless somebody steps in. And I'd like to know if the Vatican has made any sort of overtures to broker a peace. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Well, we just saw actually in the chat that the Holy Father paid a visit to the Russian embassy to the Holy See today. And I'm sure that was a peace mission, and of course of the highest level. So it's beginning the operation of the Holy See to work for peace. On that point, we can be sure. Regarding the support to people, on the question of the Russians, maybe I'll hand that over to Hugo in a moment. But to do with the Ukrainians, we have shared in the drive that you can access. Marina has shared several times this link. Maybe she can do it again. There's a message from our the Vicar Provincial in Ukraine telling you about where you can send support for their work. So this would be one very concrete and practical way of doing it. Yes, Marina's just shared it again in the chat. So you can download from there part of a message he sent with indications about where you can make support for them. Okay, so now I would like to ask Stefano Macario. If you could open your microphone and speak, Stefano. Stefano, can you open your microphone? Okay, that doesn't seem to be working at the moment. Maybe our team can try to get hold of Stefano. What about Anna Maria? Could you open your microphone and speak? No. Or Alice? Alice? Okay, now your microphone is open. Please go ahead, Alice. No, it's closed again. There's some problems with these microphones. Okay, Stefano, your microphone is open, I think, now. Can you speak to us? No. So, okay, well, while we're trying to sort some of this out, maybe we can turn again to Hugo. Maybe you could say something about what do you think, Hugo, could be ways of supporting the Russian people who are demonstrating against the war, or any of the issues that Father Andrea was bringing up? Thanks.
Thank you. So, I mean, listening to Andrea's important questions, sanctions, I don't think sanctions are going to stop the military invasion and what follows. And I think eventually, as sanctions widen, you get the typical dilemma that the sanctions then begin to bite the Russian people. And that's always the dilemma with sanctions. So at the moment, they're trying to hit individuals, which is the current strategy. But the moment they go wider, sanctions will bite Russian people and actually European people in reverse, in a sort of blowback that often happens with sanctions. So, I think we shouldn't put all our hope in sanctions for reversing this war. I think your point about the Patriarch of Moscow is very, very important. And I think, as I said in my talk, that, that particular church is, in a sense, part of Putin's project. And I think whatever the Holy See can do with back channels, phrases you probably know, back channels into the Patriarch to try and, even if we don't get public endorsements and support, we get some kind of private commitments through the back channel to the Holy See. I think that's an important diplomatic strategy that I hope is being pursued with the Patriarch of Moscow, so that if that church is not, as I said, weaponized in any re-Russianing process in Ukraine. Mary, how can we help? I know it's always feeling that's what we should be trying to do. I think the awful thing and the truth about some of these situations is we have to stand and trust in the resilience of Ukrainian people. And we've heard 3 very resilient, powerful young Ukrainians today, and there will be millions of people like that who will be surviving and trying to change things and trying to hold fast to their beliefs and their ideals. So I think resting in the knowledge that those people have the strength is very important. But I think in terms of trying to help young Ukrainians, young Russians, as you said, who are taking risks on the street. Again, there's not much physically one can do because you are not there, but I think in this day and age, there's a lot you can do about visibility. So I hope that, that there are people working to keep a visible digital record of what they're doing, who they are, what their names are. If they get sent detained, we know who they are. So I think that business of transparency around how people are protesting and then how they're being punished for protesting and where they are is incredibly important. And that is a major role of giving visibility to their struggle so that nothing can happen so easily in the dark around those protests and things. I think that's important, but it's hard. This is a very resolute Russian regime, which doesn't have to account for its actions on the whole. So I think that, and I think channels will open up for money for people to support civil society movements and protests and resistance networks. And I think that will take shape. So there's another way eventually.
Okay, great. Thank you, Hugo. So we still need you to raise your hands if you would like to speak, because then our tech people will open your microphones, and then you also need to open your microphone locally as well. Okay, so we have Michał Paluk. Please, Michał, go ahead.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a very rich meeting, and I really appreciate a lot all the talks and all small bigger speeches. I would like just to say that I was a little bit frozen by the tone of inevitability in the presentation of Dr. Hugh. I agree with it with my mind, but I don't want to agree with it with my heart. I understand very much that it was a sign of professionalism and as well that it was it's very helpful to consider rather the worst possible scenario if we are thinking about humanitarian catastrophes. Nevertheless, I would like, to have a little bit more hope that perhaps Putin is not so strong as we imagine. That perhaps the Ukrainian resistance will show much more important and bigger than and the whole state much more difficult to swallow than we imagine. So I understand that it is something we take into account. Nevertheless, I would like to add to this reaction a little bit to what I could learn today. One question and one proposal, yes, one dream. So my question is where to put in our agenda, in our thinking about the future, the big theme reconciliation between Ukrainians and the Russians. I understand that as we know. Justice is the first step to start to think about reconciliation. Nevertheless, I think that we shouldn't forget about it. And my dream is that I would say that as the reaction to what's happening just now, all the capitals of Europe will be filled with peace marches organized, but I don't know by whom. It's my question, and perhaps how to put into reality this dream. And Rome might have such a powerful march with Pope Francis in the first row, perhaps with President Mattarella, just to show that we disagree, and it's something more than diplomatic, how to say, negotiations just now. We are coming to such an preposterous attempt to break international law and human freedom that we just cannot allow it to happen without trying, to really show something, show up, speak up, and do something in solidarity. As you understand, it's very important, to show our solidarity to the Ukrainian people, which is just confronted with the invasion. But at the same time, I think it's very important for the health of the European societies. If we are less and less capable, to speak up, to show our solidarity and to react to such preposterous acts of violence, it means that we become more and more unable to defend ourselves and to keep our way of life, which is so important to all of us. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Michał. So we are coming towards the end. So I would like to, before asking Hugo to respond to that, because I think there is something useful for him to say in response, to hear Nathan, and then we also have a question on the Q&A, which I would like to put to Hugo. Please go ahead, Nathan.
Yeah, thank you, sister. I just wanted to say, first and foremost, thank you to each of our contributors today. It's been really special to be able to show this brilliant experience of solidarity. I have a question for Dr. Slim about his mention in his speech about disinformation, the disinformation that the Russian regime is pushing, and then also in tandem with his latest or his most recent sort of advice for us on this transparency work and our ability to sort of showcase and document through social media or technologically different forms of abuses. So those in tandem, I want to see if there's anything that you recommend, Dr. Slim, for making sure that we don't accidentally fall for that disinformation, that in a rush to post on Instagram or a rush to post on social media, or in an earnest attempt to be a part of that transparency work, we don't accidentally sort of perpetuate false news that the Russian regime, of course, would be pushing.
Okay, thank you, Nathan. And so I'll just add to that last question, then we'll go back to Hugo to finish. Question from Stefano Macario, who's a very interesting student we have in our department. He's always going on missions around the world. He's a medic. He's been in Somalia this year and various other places. So his question is, we mentioned the role of the church in preventing the escalation of violence. Recently, some Italian columnists have said that one scary scenario would be not only an escalation of violence inside Ukraine, but also a possible invasion of Taiwan from China, and also an aggression to the Baltic republics from Russia. How likely is this escalation to happen, according to you, Mr. Hugo Slim? And how can the church act to prevent this danger? Thank you very much. So please go ahead, Hugo. You've got a few things to respond to there.
I have, Helen, but I really feel the last word should go to Elena and Maria and Marina, because it's their challenge. But I'll be as quick as I can. So on Taiwan and the Baltics, I think you're right, Stefano. I think we've known for some time, as the world becomes a world of great powers again, that the trigger points would always be between Russia and the West would be Ukraine, and between China and the West would be Taiwan. So those are the places. And I think if one happens, it's possible at some point that China will take back or try to take back Taiwan as well. I hate to think about the Baltic states, but certainly they're vulnerable, absolutely. But it also always depends in these situations how many military fronts a power is prepared to take on at one time. So Russia may You know, Putin has strategic patience, so we'll see what he decides to do. Michal, I agree so much with everything you've said, and I felt it's important to give a political analysis of how we need to understand the Russian plan, as it were, because I think unless you understand the plan, you can't respond to it and resist it properly. So I think that realism is important, and I totally share your hope that the Ukrainians rise up and resist with great effect. And I also actually have a personal hope that this war in Ukraine will be the end of Putin somehow. The tragedy with dictators and their ends is that the end of a dictator always involves the end of so many other human lives. So Nathan, on disinformation, and Michal, I would also agree with you totally, and I should have said it, and I was wrong not to, that the church must demonstrate, because demonstrate is proof of the kingdom of God in a sense, but it's also good for the soul to, you know, live out that truth of the justice of the kingdom of God. So I totally agree, and I should have said that in the sense as the fourth thing of my 3 points. It should have been the church must demonstrate justice in a sense. Nathan, on disinformation and everything, you know, I do think we're going to start seeing in our own personal telephones a lot of Instagram posts, a lot of Twitter posts that are done by Russian bots now. So we're going to be in our own personal information space heavily targeted by misinformation, disorientation, etc. You know, the 3 Ds in Russian stuff is that I've got deflection, denial, and diversion. And we will be, you know, the targets in our own telephones of those 3 Ds. So we got to be discerning in what we listen to and where we find the truth. And I think on this business of showing, you know, abuses, but it's very important to show strength as well. So we need to be able to show that actually that was a big demonstration. There were lots of people there. So it's not just about showing violations. And I'll stop there and thank everyone very much for such an interesting event. And
great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Hugo. We do have one last person who came in, Emmanuel. If it's a really quick question, Emmanuel, we can take it.
Yeah, thank you. It's very quick. I want to ask Hugo precisely whether it is possible to think of an alternative scenario. Could the war be prevented at this point? Thank you.
So, Emmanuel, thank you. I struggle to think of an alternative at this point. I don't think Putin will parley for a ceasefire if he thinks he's about to get what he wants. I think the only thing he could parley for is a neutral Ukraine that refuses to join NATO, and then a policy of neutrality perhaps in the Baltic states and other things so that they step out of NATO. I'm not sure that's going to happen. And if he takes Ukraine in some form and then is right up against NATO on the Polish, Hungarian, and other borders, then he doesn't need that neutrality anymore. So I can't see, I'm afraid. You know, and I'm talking as a sort of political analyst, I can't see what will make him parley.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, do our lovely Ukrainian respondents want to add anything at all after the discussion? No?
I just would like to say thank you for the support, for all the messages that we've received. It's very important. I hope in our hearts, I mean, it's still there and we're hoping for the better, and prayer together is really important for all of us in this vulnerable and very difficult moment. Thanks again.
Thank you, Elena. Okay, Maria, please.
Sì, grazie. Anch'io vorrei ringraziare tutti voi, a lei, Sor Helen, a signor Hugo Slim e tutti i partecipanti. Vorrei aggiungere anche, c'è veramente la domanda di padre Andrea, che ha posto la domanda per primo, se non sbaglio, che la Chiesa russa ortodossa finora non ha detto niente sulla pace. Come sappiamo, il padre della Chiesa, Sant'Agostino, diceva che la Chiesa e Stato sono sì perfettamente distinguibili, ma non ci sono comunque dei confini. Qui vorrei sottolineare che in Russia veramente i confini non ci sono, cioè sembra che la Chiesa sta troppo sotto le potenze politiche, perché se fino ad oggi la Chiesa ortodossa sta muta, ci dispiace tanto veramente, perché la Chiesa cattolica, Santo Padre Francesco, ultimi giorni sempre ribadito, ha pregato per la pace dell'Ucraina, in Ucraina, e le chiese nostre, la Chiesa greco-cattolica ucraina e tutto il resto, e tutti, anche altre religioni, anche altri colleghi e amici di diverse religioni, infatti, ma non sentiamo niente da parte di... E quindi si vede che non esistono confini in Russia tra lo Stato e la Chiesa. Non esistono proprio. Grazie.
Thank you, Maria. Marina, you like to say something?
Vi ringrazio a tutti e spero che tutti insieme possiamo combattere. Grazie.
Okay. Thank you so much, Marina. Thank you to all our speakers. So now we are concluding this part of our session. I hope that you've all seen on the drive the link. We have all the documentation there. We've now been able to add the comments of Philip McDonough, who just sent them to us. So you have there the main speaker, the comments from the provincial and how to help the province there. You have Philip's comments. And we also now, for the last section that we're moving into, we have the 2 sets of prayers in English and Italian, which you can download from the same drive. I'm sure Marina will put the link in the chat again. So I'm now going to hand over to 3 of our seminarians in our faculty, Andrei Polivka, Lyubomir Kostyuk, and Sviatoslav Makar, who are going to lead us in the prayers for peace. They're all Ukrainian Greek Catholic seminarians in the Faculty of Social Sciences. So I'm going to finish my role here as moderator because we want to finish with the prayers. So before I hand over to them, it just remains for me to thank our main speaker very much, Hugo, our respondents, Elena, Marina, and Maria, all those who participated in the discussion, Philip, Yaroslav, and all of you who spoke and helped us understand more about this issue. And of course, all of you who've been present with us in this webinar, all those of you who are watching the recorded version of the webinar afterwards. So now we turn our thoughts in prayer to God, asking that His grace may work in the hearts of all of us so that this crisis may be quickly resolved.
Nel nome del Padre, del Figlio e dello Spirito Santo. Amen. La pace, la carità e la forza da parte di Dio Padre e del Signore nostro Gesù Cristo siano con tutti voi e con il tuo spirito. Preghiamo. O Dio, sei tu la nostra pace, ma non ti può comprendere che semina discordia e non ti può accogliere chi ama la violenza. Dona ai costruttori della pace la forza di perseverare nel loro proposito e a quelli che la turbano con i loro pensieri e le loro azioni, di essere liberati dall'egoismo e dall'odio per Cristo nostro Signore. Amen. Dal capitolo 7 dell'enciclica Fratelli Tutti. La guerra non è un fantasma del passato, ma è diventata una minaccia costante.
Il mondo sta trovando sempre più difficoltà nel tento cammino della pace che aveva intrapreso e che nuovamente le condizioni per la proliferazione di guerre. Voglio allora ricordare a tutti che la guerra è la negazione di tutti i diritti, è una drammatica aggressione all'ambiente. Se si vuole un autentico sviluppo umano integrale per tutti, occorre proseguire senza stancarsi nell'impegno di evitare le guerre tra le nazioni e tra i popoli. Di fatto, negli ultimi decenni tutte le guerre hanno preteso di avere una giustificazione. Dunque non possiamo più pensare alla guerra come soluzione, dato che i rischi probabilmente saranno sempre superiori all'ipotetica utilità che gli si attribuisce. Davanti a tale realtà, oggi è molto difficile sostenere criteri razionali, maturati in altri secoli per parlare di una possibile guerra giusta. Ma più la guerra. Ogni guerra lascia il mondo peggiore di come lo ha trovato. La guerra è un fallimento della politica e dell'umanità, una resa vergognosa, una sconfitta di fronte alle forze del male. Non fermiamoci su discussioni teoriche, prendiamo contatto con le ferite, tocchiamo la carne di chi subisce i danni. Preghiamo insieme. Signore Dio di pace, ascolta la nostra supplica. Abbiamo provato tante volte e per tanti anni a risolvere i nostri conflitti con le nostre forze e anche con le nostre armi. Tanti momenti di ostilità e di oscurità, tanto sangue versato, tante vite spezzate, tante speranze seppellite. Ma i nostri sforzi sono stati vani. Ora, Signore, aiutaci tu. Signore Dio di pace, ascolta la nostra supplica.
Donaci tu la pace, insegnaci tu la pace, guidaci tu verso la pace. Apri i nostri occhi e i nostri cuori e donaci il coraggio di dire mai più la guerra. Con la guerra tutto è distrutto. Infondi in noi il coraggio di compiere gesti concreti per costruire la pace. Signore di Dio, Abramo e dei profeti. Signore Dio di pace, ascolta la nostra supplica. Dio, amore che ci hai creati e ci chiami a vivere da fratelli, donaci la forza per essere ogni giorno artigiani della pace. Donaci la capacità di guardare con benevolenza tutti i fratelli che incontriamo sul nostro cammino. Rendici disponibili ad ascoltare il grido dei nostri cittadini che ci chiedono di trasformare le nostre armi in strumenti di pace, le nostre paure in fiducia e le nostre tensioni in perdono. Signore Dio di pace, ascolta la nostra supplica. Tieni accesa in noi la fiamma della speranza per compiere con paziente perseveranza scelte di dialogo e di riconciliazione, perché vinca finalmente la pace e che dal cuore di ogni uomo siano bandite queste parole: divisione, odio, guerra. Signore, disarma la lingua e le mani, rinnova i cuori e le menti, perché la parola che ci fa incontrare sia sempre fratello e lo stile della nostra vita diventi pace. Signore Dio di pace, ascolta la nostra supplica. A Dio Padre di tutti, sorgente della pace, con fiducia rivolgiamo la nostra preghiera di figli. Padre nostro, che sei nei cieli, sia santificato il tuo nome, venga il tuo regno, sia fatta la tua volontà, come in cielo così in terra. Dacci oggi il nostro pane quotidiano e rimetti a noi i nostri debiti, come anche noi li rimettiamo ai nostri debitori, e non abbandonarci alla tentazione, ma liberaci dal male. Amen.